From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's what's ahead. K-State's Sarah Lancaster will go over the best herbicide options for controlling that rapidly advancing Palmer amaranth in grain sorghum. And Sarah reminds you producers about knocking out any volunteer wheat that might now be turning up in wheat stubble. Following up then, K-State's Jeff Whitworth with more on that wheat curl mite. Jeff saying that controlling that volunteer is but part of the answer for keeping those mites from infesting newly planted wheat this fall. And further ahead, this week's wildlife management segment, K-State's Charlie Lee talks today about the ecological importance of beavers and how that should factor into beaver damage control. All this and more next on Agriculture Today. Welcome once again. You're tuned in to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. First up for you, thoughts on crop weed control and narrowing that down to that grain sorghum. Some possible explosions of weeds out there we're hearing about, particularly one species which is problematic, it seems, year in, year out. Along with us is crop weed management specialist Sarah Lancaster, K-State Research and Extension. You just put an article out on this in the E-Update newsletter series, Sarah, on Palmer amaranth. It is apparently asserting itself in grain sorghum stands out there, Sarah.
Yeah, Eric, this time of year, this is a common question that we get as extension specialists and from the county agents as well, is how to control Palmer amaranth and emerged grain sorghum. So, as your listeners are aware, there's not a lot of post-emergent herbicide options in grain sorghum, especially ones that are effective on Palmer amaranth, especially Palmer amaranth that is very large at all. So, we really do rely on those pre-emergence herbicides to control weeds in grain sorghum, both, grasses as well as broadleaves like Palmer amaranth. So this spring, when we had such tough conditions for pre-emergence herbicide activity, that as well as some uneven emergence of grain sorghum in some situations, that's led to some interesting questions on managing Palmer in grain sorghum.
So has the pre-emergence treatment come up short, or is it just a matter of conditions out there? What?
Conditions mostly. So a lot of it went on in hot, dry conditions and didn't get a good activating rain. And so just the activity of that residual herbicide wasn't really what we were hoping for, or what we really needed to get the grain sorghum through to canopy.
So there really aren't a whole lot of surefire post-emergence control measures, but there are some things that producers can do to knock that Palmer amaranth back if they catch it at the right stage of growth?
So, Eric, this is almost a pick-your-poison sort of situation once the Palmer amaranth gets any size. So, number one, we say this every time we talk about weeds in general, Palmer in particular, the smaller the better, right? We're aiming, a lot of the labels say 4 inches, but really, 2 to 3 inches is probably your target weed size there for controlling Palmer, especially with some of the options that are labeled for post application in grain sorghum. So a couple of things going on. Many of the herbicides that are labeled are only effective on very small Palmer, and many of the more effective options are going to have fairly substantial crop response, some of which could translate to yield loss and has been shown to translate to some yield loss.
Crop burn, or maybe even more serious than that?
So a lot of them are going to result in leaf burn. So husky is one that is associated with leaf burn. It's got bromoxynil in there and is typically applied with a surfactant. So that combination is going to lend itself to leaf burn. AIM, or carfentrazone, is the active ingredient there. That one is also going to result in some leaf burn. Other problems that you might run into with 2,4-D and dicamba, you can get some lodging. And there are also, particularly with 2,4-D and dicamba, some pretty important height or growth stage restrictions that you need to follow to make sure that you're not going to cause damage to the grain, to the seed head.
One name that pops up, and it always does in weed control for grain sorghum, is atrazine. Is that the surest bet at this stage?
So atrazine is going to do a couple of things for you. It does provide good Palmer amaranth control, assuming a couple of things. Number one, that your Palmer amaranth population is not triazine resistant. And then the second thing is that you still have the ability to apply more atrazine to your field for that year, that you're not going over that rate limit for your area. So atrazine also has an important role. We mentioned husky just a minute ago. Those HPPD inhibiting or group 27 herbicides, like the main active ingredient in husky, they perform better with a little bit of atrazine. So, atrazine is going to be an important piece of that mix as well. So, some of the tougher situations that I have had brought to my attention, Eric, that's kind of what we're recommending is husky with atrazine. And you can tank mix 2,4-D with that as well. So you can add that low rate of 2,4-D to increase your activity on the pigweeds there as well. So, those are just some things to think about and sort of some of the things, the conversations that I've been having with some of our county agents.
Application method here, though, and how your spray rig is outfitted, drop nozzles, are they important here, depending on the stage of grain sorghum growth?
Yeah, thanks for bringing me back to that, Eric. With 2,4-D and dicamba, you can extend the application time if you use drop nozzles. So once that grain sorghum gets much beyond 8 inches, you're going to want to use the drop nozzles to provide additional protection for that crop. Again, you'll have to be careful with crop growth stages and making sure you're under your atrazine rate and paying attention to adjuvant use. But that's probably the best bet that folks can go with at this point in the growing season.
Unless they want to commit to mechanical removal.
Yes, unless they are in a situation where conventional tillage is an option.
They need to hop on this right away if they're going to attain any decent level of controlling Palmer amaranth in that grain sorghum here before that weed gets too far along, because word has it has been progressing quite swiftly in our fields around Kansas. One other thing we did want to address while you were here, Sarah, and we will be talking more about this with K-State's Jeff Whitworth in just a moment, thinking about the potential for volunteer wheat following this wheat crop and the need for controlling that volunteer, and Jeff will elaborate on why. But producers that have volunteer out there need to go after it soon, and by what preferred route?
Yes, Eric. The sooner the better, really, with volunteer wheat control. We've had, in a lot of places, enough rain to get that first flush of volunteer wheat to come out of the ground. So, we need to be going over those wheat acres anyway to control our friend Palmer amaranth, and kochia and other weeds. And so just making sure that we're approaching this in a timely manner. The products you're using for those other weeds should take care of your volunteer weed as well. Again, glyphosate is an inexpensive and effective option here.
But again, before too much time passes, jump on that issue. Likewise, have a look at what Sarah has written up in specific on Palmer amaranth control in grain sorghum with the options she walked through with us here in the Agronomy E-Update newsletter posted this past Thursday, the 15th of July. That's at agronomy.ksu.edu as well. And as always, refer to the 2021 Chemical Weed Control for Field Crops Guide out of K-State for more specific product information. Sarah, good to have you by once more. We'll have you back again. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric.
Joining us here, Weed Management Specialist Sarah Lancaster of K-State Research and Extension. We'll go ahead and usher in now crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth of K-State Research and Extension to talk more about that volunteer control and otherwise interrupting, Jeff, the cycle of the wheat curl mite ahead of fall wheat planting. And this is, you say, an area of management that our wheat growers need to be attuning to even now.
Well, good morning, and thank you for having me here today. And the traditional annual talk about getting rid of volunteer goes on, and it's for all wheat pests, period. So I hope everybody out there remembers that and tries to incorporate a good volunteer wheat eradication program every year. But this year, the wheat curl mite, it seems to me, has been moving east, traditionally it's been a pest in probably about the 1/4 to 1/3 part of western Kansas. And now we're starting to see more and more wheat streak mosaic, which is indicative of the wheat curl mite. Generally, that's our indicator of wheat curl mites. A little bit about that I think folks don't understand about the biology of the wheat curl mite. First of all, they're really tiny, and they're generally at the base of the plant or in some protected part of the plant, of the wheat plant we're talking about. Mm-hmm. If their numbers build up sufficiently because of their feeding, it will cause the tip and the sides of the wheat plant to curl over. That's where they get their name, wheat curl mite. If there's just a few, it doesn't cause that. Just due to the feeding alone, wheat curl mites probably are not going to do much in the way of yield reduction or damage to a plant. And not all wheat curl mites have the virus that causes wheat streak mosaic. Not all wheat curl mites are infected with the virus, so they don't all transmit it. Fortunately, hot, dry conditions, like we often have in Kansas in the summer, that restricts or retards or slows down the mite's ability to reproduce and to develop, actually. So they kind of, usually in the heat of the summer, they're not as active, they're not reproducing as much, but they're still alive. It's not, that heat is not going to kill them.
And in that, they'll still be around, you say. That's where mite management becomes important as we edge ever closer to wheat planting time in the fall, and we want to cover that, Jeff, after the break. We're visiting here with K-State's Jeff Whitworth. We'll return with him after this. This is Agriculture Today. We're back now on Agriculture Today and in the midst of a visit with K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth about getting the jump on new wheat crop diseases, wheat streak mosaic primary among them, via wheat curl mite control. And cultural management, by and large, is the ticket here. Jeff, you tell us that ever since the just harvested wheat crop started to fully mature back in late spring, the curl mite has long since fled to other plant hosts.
Well, as the wheat starts to dry down or senesce in, late May to mid-June here in Kansas, the mites that are on those plants, they crawl up, and that's another thing. They can't jump, they can't run, they can't fly. They just crawl up to the tip of the plant, and they let the wind blow them. So the mites will kind of, at random, infest other plants nearby. If, in Kansas winds, it's always blowing. It can blow from the south, north, any direction. So any grass nearby has a pretty good chance of being infested with the wheat curl mite itself. In this case, a lot of times in Kansas, it's corn, because there'll be corn growing by, there'll be sorghum, or any other grass. The wheat curl mite can infest grasses and can utilize that as a host. Maybe not as well as wheat, but they can still exist on it. So that's one of the problems we have trying to control this thing. Johnson grass or just about any grass could be a host. Now, it's really only wheat that is susceptible to these viruses. So even though the mites may be infected with the virus themselves, it doesn't negatively affect corn, sorghum, or any of the other grasses, barley, rye, oats, any of that kind of stuff. It's mainly wheat that is the problem. But again, that can be a transition, or it can be, when we double crop with sorghum or we double crop with corn, we get out and plant it pretty early, and there's a little bit of volunteer left. These plants start growing. So that's where we get the cycle of wheat curl mites can continue. Even though we're doing a really good job of controlling volunteer, they can also be on sorghum or corn. And if we double crop and there's some open areas, there can, like you said earlier, there can be some places where there was some spillage or some wheat, so we got volunteer wheat out there. So it provides a nice habitat for alternate hosts for the wheat curl mites to be able to survive the summer until the fall when we go about planting wheat again.
It's important, though, to break up that cycle as much as one can.
It is, but what I'm saying, it's difficult. It's very difficult, and I think that's one of the reasons why the mites are slowly working their way east. I say slowly. We did a survey, 5 or 6 years ago, and we found wheat curl mites all the way over to the Missouri border. So, in my opinion, they're moving slowly, but a lot of the growers think they're moving faster than they would like to see them. But that's kind of the cycle. But the best way to mitigate wheat curl mite and wheat streak mosaic damage, about the time the corn starts drying down or the sorghum starts drying down, again, that's when the mites crawl out to the end of the leaves, to the tip of the plant, and they're waiting for the wind to come along and blow them to another suitable host. If they don't find a suitable host, a grass that's green and translocating within probably 12 to 20 hours, they can only last about 24 hours without feeding. If it's cooler, they can last a little bit longer. If it's hotter, they don't do well, much over 85 degrees. So, once we get to the point in time where the sorghum or the corn or whatever it is starting to dry down, they're going to crawl out to the end of the leaves and wait for the wind to blow them, and wherever the wind blows them. So that's why we always say, if that's September or October, whenever your corn or your sorghum is drying down, you're starting to think about planting wheat before you have to harvest your corn or your sorghum, hold off as long as you possibly can, because one of the other ways to help mitigate or lessen the impact of the mite on wheat is to plant late. And that's for any wheat pest, whether it's a disease or an insect or a mite, Hessian fly, whatever it is. The later you can hold off planting, the better off you are. That doesn't mean you're not going to have a problem, but there's less chance and less time for that pest to build up to numbers that may cause a problem. So it's the fall that we're mainly worried about. Also, if those mites start infesting and start feeding, and they are carrying the virus, or they're vectoring the virus, the wheat streak mosaic virus is much more damaging to wheat if it gets started in the fall than it is in the spring. It can start any time, but in the falls when it generally, we have some serious negative impacts, and to the point where it can kill out the plants. They can't overwinter, so you have to replant with a spring crop. We're starting to see that a little more for whatever reason. Now I realize it's easy for me to sit here and say, control your volunteer in a timely fashion. That's a great recommendation. That's really easy to say, but when you get out there and you actually, in fact, have to do it and you got to fight the weather, it's raining and you got other crops and other things to do. But I'm just telling you, in an ideal situation, the later you plant, the better off we are to mitigate any pests problems with in wheat. And one of the questions I always get about, is there any resistant? Are there resistant varieties? Not real good. I mean, there's some that are semi-resistant or tolerant to wheat streak mosaic, but not too many that are resistant to the feeding of the wheat curl mite. But we're still working on that. Mm-hmm. But I don't foresee any coming in the next year or two.
And also, for the record, no miticide is a benefit here.
Well, there are some miticides available, and there are some insecticides that are labeled, but the economics is just not there. These mites generally are not field-wide. There will be a patch here or a patch there. So what we're trying to do is mitigate before they get started and get into the point where they're in a field-wide basis. We have tested some miticides, and they do work. But again, we don't recommend the use of a miticide or an insecticide, unless if you're going to do that, remember it's timing. It's all about timing. These mites, once they build up to the point where generally the growers notice them, those leaves are pretty curled, and those mites are down inside that. So you got to use considerable gallonage to get the miticide or the insecticide down to where they are. So at the present time, if you make sure you destroy all your volunteer at least 10 days to 2 weeks prior to planting your fall crop and plant as late as you possibly can. Those are probably the two best scenarios to help fight the infestation of wintergreen mites, Hessian flies, wheat curl mites, barley yellow dwarf caused by the aphids, etc.
Did want to make mention of barley yellow dwarf, another insect vector disease. Producers ought to be orienting their thoughts toward that management too, you say?
Yes, barley yellow dwarf, again, is a disease vectored by aphids. There's probably 20, 25 different types of aphids. The bird triote aphid's the main one that we have in Kansas. This year it hasn't been bad. I mean, these things really don't overwinter in Kansas, so they come in southern breezes, southern winds, and it's basically how well they do in the southern part of the United States or northern Mexico. As you know, last year we had a lot of cold weather extended clear down into the Mexico-United States border, and so far it's worked out pretty well. We haven't had that many aphids migrate in on wheat. Now we are seeing, or we're hearing about sugarcane aphids coming in on sorghum, but they're not here yet, so we'll see. But as they migrate in more and more, hopefully they won't migrate to the point where barley yellow dwarf is a problem either.
We'll stay on top of that. One last pest I want to squeeze in a word about here, Jeff. You say white flies are prominent out there in cropping situations too?
In soybeans, yes. We've gotten a lot of calls, and a couple of weeks ago when we had our CARA meetings with K-State, guys were really telling me they're seeing a lot of white flies in soybeans, and that's not unusual. This year there may be more than there usually are. Right now, as the beans start to grow and we have good growing conditions, those leaves are nice green, and the guys go out and look, make sure they're getting a good stand, nothing chewing on them, and they see these real little tiny little white flies all over the leaves, and that's concerning to them. White flies, they do suck the juice out of plants, but I've never seen them build up to the point where they're even anything to worry about in crops, maybe in a greenhouse or something like that. But as far as soybeans go, you can find them in alfalfa, but soybeans is where they really stand out, but they've really never been a problem.
They're more a visual impression than anything else. Keep us in the know on what else comes along in the way of insect pressure in our field crops as we're now pushing toward the latter part of the summer eventually here, Jeff. Thanks for coming over.
Sure, my pleasure. Thank you.
Main message here today is make plans to contend with that volunteer wheat and suppress the activity of the wheat curl mite. Wheat producers, before planting time for the next crop, amazingly enough, is but a couple of months away. Jeff Whitworth, crop entomologist, K-State Research and Extension, is along with us regularly on Agriculture Today. Agriculture Today continues now. Eric Atkinson with you. In the latest Kansas Crop Progress and Condition Report out yesterday from the USDA for the week ending this past Sunday, our topsoil moisture in the state, 7% surplus, 68% adequate, and 25% short to very short. Subsoil, 4% surplus, 71% adequate moisture, and 25% short to very short. The condition of the Kansas corn crop, 74% good to excellent this week, 19% fair, 7% poor to very poor. Corn silking at 57%. That's behind the 62% average. In the dough stage at 13%, near average. Soybean crop conditions, 68% good to excellent, 25% fair, 7% poor to very poor. Soybeans blooming at 48% now, near the average, and setting pods at 14%, also near the average. And the grain sorghum crop is at 71% good to excellent, 25% fair, and 4% poor to very poor, with sorghum headed in the state now at 12%. For the national conditions for corn and soybeans now, we turn to the USDA's Gary Crawford.
Much of the Midwest growing areas got some timely rains over this past week.
And that led to stabilization of crop conditions.
Especially for the corn crop, USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey says as of this past Sunday, the percent of corn crop in good to excellent condition nationally, same as the week before.
65%. We did see a 1-point increase in the very poor to poor ratings, 9% versus 8% last week.
Because those rains did not reach up into the northern corn growing areas.
For example, in North Dakota, where very little rain fell, 32% of the corn rated very poor. Last week, that number was 27%.
Now, South Dakota did get some rain, and as a result,
we saw an overall net decrease in the very poor to poor ratings from last week's 24% to 21%.
As far as corn development, overall 56% of the nation's corn already in the silking stage or beyond, compared to the average for this time of 52%. For soybeans, after some rains in many growing areas this past week,
we did see a net slight increase in the overall condition.
The share of the U.S. bean crop in the good to excellent category went from 59 to 60%. The share of the crop in poor to very poor shape stayed the same, 11%. That's despite the rains missing the far northern growing areas and sending soybean conditions there spiraling downward.
North Dakota remains extraordinarily dry. 41% of the soybeans rated very poor to poor, a 4-point jump from last week. Minnesota, a 2-point jump from 15 to 17% very poor to poor.
Parts of South Dakota did get some rain. The result?
A decrease in very poor to poor ratings from 28 to 23%.
Soybean crop development nationally, mostly ahead of normal, 63% of the crop blooming, 23% setting pods. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
And rounding out the national story, grain sorghum headed at 33% now. That's near the average. And sorghum coloring at 17%. The sorghum condition nationally, 68% good to excellent this week. That was down 2% from the previous week. That from the USDA. And now it's on to this week's edition of Milk Lines with K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk. Mike?
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairymen concerning what we're seeing on somatic cell counts. Recently, the Federal Milk Order Administrator in the Central Order provided some interesting data from the year 2020 concerning our average somatic cell counts here in the dairy industry. The somatic cell count is one of the ways that we look at producer milk quality. And our producers here in the Central Order have been doing very well. In fact, the average for 2020 was actually lower than 2019. Our average somatic cell count over the year averaged 192,000 cells per mil, which is much lower than the average for the last 20 years of 257,000 cells per mil. So as we look at this number, what does it really mean? Well, it really means that we're doing an excellent job of reducing the mastitis in our dairy herds. Somatic cell is also a way that we measure the prevalence of mastitis in our herds. So through various methods, we have reduced somatic cell. One of those ways would be using dry cow treatments as we dry our animals off. Another important part of that control is making sure that we use good milking procedures as well as disinfecting the teat ends prior to releasing cows from the milking parlor at the end of milking. It's a lot of little details that have to be taken care of. One of the big things that we have really improved on our dairy farms is reducing the chances that bacteria might come in contact with those teat ends, particularly after milking. So the overall cleanliness of our dairies has improved greatly over the last 20 years. So hats off to you as dairy producers. This is really a testament to what you try to do every day to try to produce a quality product for the general public here in the United States. As we look at some of the trends throughout the year, again, during the summertime, we see an increase in somatic cell count. Over the last many years, generally our highest somatic cell counts occur in the month of August, and they're generally usually about 20% higher than what we would normally see at other times of the year. This is not all that unusual as we have warmer weather, so bacteria multiply quicker. We also have issues with heat stress, so animals will seek a wet, cool place to try to lay down. This increases the chances that we might have the teat ends come in contact with bacteria that could cause mastitis. So, in general, we're doing a really great job as dairy producers. One of the other interesting things that I see as I look at this data is when we look at it by farm size. And really, as the Milk Market Administrator looked at the data, they looked at it as the number of pounds of milk shipped on average per month from an individual dairy. As we look at that, our dairies that ship more than 2 million pounds of milk per month actually had lower cell counts than dairies that were shipping less than that. Not terribly much lower, but lower, about 20% lower than many of the other dairies that are in these averages. As we look at that and we think about what's happening in our dairy industry here in the state of Kansas, as we see herd sizes grow in terms of numbers, that also means that in general, these herds are doing a better job controlling somatic cell count and producing a higher quality milk to put on the market for our consumers. So hats off to you dairymen here in Kansas for an excellent job in reducing somatic cell counts in your herd. Just encourage you to keep up with the diligence in this area so that we can continue to provide high quality milk for the market. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension.
All right, Mike, many thanks. And you're listening to Agriculture Today. Coming your way now on This Agriculture Today, our weekly stint on wildlife management, and once more across the way is former wildlife specialist Charlie Lee, K-State Research and Extension. Charlie, an overview here now of a common species in Kansas, and some appreciate them, some not so much, beavers.
Beavers are primarily aquatic animals, but it's their propensity for going on cropland and damaging crops or damming small streams and backing water up where it's not wanted that gets them into trouble with humans. By and large, they're economically important to humans. They've been a significant item in the fur trade for a couple of centuries. They're fairly beneficial to the environment in that they create habitats for many aquatic organisms, including fish, amphibians, and any other animal that uses a wetland-type environment. They do feed on trees and brush, aquatic vegetation. They're eating the bark and the cambium layer, which is the soft growing tissue under the bark of trees. Their favorites are often some of the softer woods, deciduous trees along creeks. They will eat roots and buds. The cellulose usually is not digested by mammals, but it's a major component of their diet, and they have microorganisms in the cecum, which is a sac or a holding cell between the large and the small intestine that allows them to digest cellulose. In zoos, beaver are often fed a softer diet, which would include lettuce, carrots, and rodent chow. So it's unusual that people have such controversial feelings about beaver. I get calls from people that want more beaver on their property and calls from people, how do we get rid of beaver? I try to tell them both ways, the good and the bad aspects about beaver. But they do have some very interesting characteristics besides their ability to digest cellulose or their ability to use cellulose that make them interesting and valuable critters in our environment.
There's been some research, you say, wanted to touch upon that today, on beaver dispersal as a natural process. What are you referring to there?
Well, beaver are monogamous, but if one mate dies, then the other one would seek out a new mate. But they form colonies, usually around their second year of life, right before a new litter is born. The other young are driven away from the colony. So that's the dispersal. There's several thoughts of why that dispersal is necessary, but it's most likely due to not allowing the population to get inbred. So then as they disperse, they make a colony of their own. It's usually maybe a mile or two away, and then they first breed about their third year of life. So that dispersal is one of the reasons it's difficult to control beaver in a small area. Like many populations, as they move, they seek the right habitat, and when that habitat is vacant, another animal may simply fill in, and beaver do the same thing. If there's good territory somewhere and they can become a dominant beaver, they may move into that territory, and thus, if you have excellent habitat, you may have to remove numerous beaver, and it may be almost impossible to keep the beaver out of an area unless you're continuously removing them.
But that can tie into damage issues and situations.
Yes, it makes it difficult and frustrating for individuals that are trying to reduce the population to have success. Removing the individual animals is one way to kind of reduce the damage. The other is to figure out what really the problem is. If it's simply cutting or girdling several of the trees that are nearby a pond or a creek, perhaps at a home site, there are things you can do by putting wire barriers, exclosure cages, if you will, around those individual trees that will physically prevent beaver from cutting them down. You can use electric fencing. Just like you would fence cattle out, you can fence beaver out of an area with electric fencing and an energizer. It's quite effective, but sometimes difficult to keep that type of equipment working if it's in an area that's subject to frequent flooding. You can also, if the problem is backing up water where they're not wanted or plugging spillways, you can put some sort of physical guard around those that prevent beaver from successfully plugging those enterprises with small branches or logs, sticks, mud, rocks, those types of things that can be physically done to change the area that beaver are able to interact in, or you simply have to remove beaver.
And therein are a number of methods that can be accomplished. But in some cases, it sounds as if coexisting with beaver might be a decent alternative here.
Well, I think people need to realize that they're very important to the environment. They're largely beneficial, but at times they do cause problems. And when they disperse maybe as many as 6 miles, it seems like you're fighting a battle that you have no chance of winning. But typically, people can solve beaver problems, particularly in places like Kansas, where perhaps water is not always as plentiful as it is in some other locations.
And the best solution to that?
Well, there are lots of options, and again, each one of those situations need to be looked at in an individual manner. And again, like always when we're solving wildlife problems, I try to encourage people to look at habitat modification first. That means what type of devices can you put between where the animal is trying to get into something that you're trying to save. When that doesn't work, can you scare them away? We've not been very successful at scaring beaver out of an area with any type of repellent, or simply remove the beaver.
We'll give due credit to the important role that beaver play in the ecosystem. Think about that as you're considering the damage that they may be inflicting and whether that merits control. Charlie, thanks. Always appreciate the input. Charlie Lee, former wildlife specialist with K-State Research and Extension. And with that, this Tuesday edition comes to a close. Before we go, to remind you once more, if you would like an automatic download of each day's broadcast, it's as easy as going to agtoday.net, where you can subscribe to that download. You'll also find each day's program in podcast form right there for listening directly, agtoday.net. In the meantime, thanks for tuning in today. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.